See, here's where I like using the $sign.
Yeah, because I run into the same situation where I want it to be very obvious that I have an employee's observable that I turn into an employee's object.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree.
traditionally,
So, the dollar here.
I mean, we could just. So basically, you're saying this is what we would want it to be as employees, except that causes the confusion.
Right. I didn't say
that looks really confusing to me.
I didn't say I loved the $sign. I said that the $sign is a really useful marker for cases exactly like this.
Right.
It's like I have an observable. Once I do some observably things, I end up with a thing. I end up with the actual object that I got out of the observable. So being able to mark the two of them with the same name but with a marker on the observable is really handy. If not that, then it's something like employees OBS. So it's very obvious. Observable, not the observable.
I mean, the scoping of which there might even be confusion should be extremely tight and narrow anyway.
If you really want to end up with employees piped async as employees,
I don't want that.
Okay. I was going to say, because we've been friends up to this point.
Like, give it a different name. But like,
So,
go ahead.
So I was curious as to we've been talking about the $sign, and that's somewhere that I think we should maybe talk about that, and mainly for me, but possibly also for the audience out there, is what is the current state of best practice for using the suffix dollar versus not using it, and what's the argument for not using it versus using it?
Gloves off.
Yeah. Next, we're going to talk about religion.
Yeah.
It appears to be a complex sinusoidal wave in terms of popularity, because like I have literally seen it ebb and flow like more than once now.
I think when TypeScript really
not to dollar
caught on, and you actually had the ability to say, oh, this is an observable of a thing, then people are like, oh, we don't need a marker anymore. Kind of the same way that the deleting underscore fell out of favor when you actually had the ability to say private. But in situations exactly like what we're looking at on screen, people have realized, oh, actually, sometimes it's really handy to have a marker that says these two things, which have nearly identical names, one of them is the observable of the other.
Right. But like the fundamental core challenge, though, is that like by the time you've actually like fully realized all the features of your component, like in a situation where you have an observable layer exposed, like all the things you're dealing with are already observables. It just creates noise. Like assume observables as the default, and there's no need to treat them special.
Well, in that case,
then you're making
imps,
two names.
Yeah, they need a convention for the non-observable thing.
Yeah. In this case, I could get away with probably employees piped async, and we just assume it's observables most of the time, and then imps becomes like employee list.
Absolutely.
So why don't we call imps employee list? And
my point is, you still have, like on a good day when the extension's feeling good, you still have type support here to tell you that the difference.
Yeah, but you shouldn't have to hover over
you're
it.
already in a tight, constrained context if you're doing your splitting of the complexity correctly anyway, to know that you've now crossed into async pipe. That's the border of where my observability ends.
I'm not worried about the tooling. It's about the coming up with synonyms.
Yeah, you look at those and like, why do those two things mean exactly the same thing?
Yeah, but so
Because
here's the
when
problem. If we add the dollar here, we've now got a split convention, or we go all the way back to dollaring all the things.
Well, don't we currently have, until fairly recently, we had dollar in some places and not in others, specifically so we could have this conversation with people and tell them, in some code in the wild that you will see, there will be dollar signs on the observables. Don't be shocked by that. It's nothing special. It doesn't actually make it work or not make it work. It's just a common convention, especially from the earlier days of RxJS. But if you don't see it, it's okay too, and a lot of our code doesn't have observables, but you still see them explicitly typed as observables. We're showing both conventions. Now, I think we may have fixed that fairly recently, but I don't know what the current state is all the way across because I haven't paid close enough attention.
The goal
I fixed it.
You fixed it?
Yeah.
Put the $sign on the template variable.
No.
Yeah, no. We'll put it in front. That's like,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah, we'll put it in front.
This is the segment of the video known as Who Invited John?
I mean, I may be in a minority, but I'm actually okay with that.
No.
I am too.
I am
Okay,
not.
that's fine if you want to
Does
do
that
that. I
work?
am never teaching that to anyone.
Does that actually work?
Absolutely.
To have the same name?
It rescopes the variable name.
Ah.
It's terrible.
It is really hard to read.
to identical names within millimeters of each other that have two fundamentally different types.
Yes.
And if it was
Right.
if it was in
Weren't
the
we-
TypeScript code, it would be a lint error.
Weren't we just talking
To
about
do the
not
exact
having
same
2
thing.
blocks of code because people are burned out on day 3? But you want to shadow a variable in the template?
I just said that I'm okay with it.
Rarely-
I'm not going to fight for it for this
Who
code.
gave Lance?
Rarely do I
Yeah, that's-
actually like come right out and tell someone that they're just wrong. You're just wrong.
We say
Yeah, that's a hill I'm willing to die on because I have gone to too many demos that like all the names were named exactly the same, even though they're all like data,
Yeah.
but they're 15 different, 15 different sets of data.
I mean, so another argument on line 12. Well, that means employee list. We actually need to put like a pound sign after that to differentiate the array from a thing in the array.
No, because a list of things and a thing are different.
Right.
Yeah.
That
And an
English
observable of
handles that.
things and a thing are different.
So they should have different names.
And they do. Employee is an employee list.
But that
But those
implies
mean
the
the
same
same
thing.
thing.
Those are synonyms. What I'm saying is one needs when we got rid of the dollar, we fought the dollar sign in the code because we have types there and you can see, okay, it's an observable. We don't need to
We have
give you
types
what
here.
type it is.
Not in HTML.
But
No, we
here we're dealing with two things, two completely different objects. One is an observable and the other is the thing inside that observable.
Sure.
And so I think the name should reflect that.
One's an array. One's a thing inside the array.
I really did not think that we were going to, when we decided to take on the step, that this is the fight we were going to have.
That's why we do this on.
well, actually, I mean, all joking aside, and this is exactly the sort of thing programmers ought to wrestle with. Naming is hard.
Yeah.
What is it? The only
I don't know,
two
Chris and I haven't
problems in
figured
computer
out.
science: naming, cache invalidation, and off by one errors.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
here's one of them, and people should think more about this stuff than they do.
Yeah.
The truth is,
Yeah.
there's probably not a perfectly right answer here. I was going to say there are no wrong answers, but you gave one of them.
Question on that though, is index as index for NG4 okay?
No, index is I.
But what if it's the only one of those?
Then you're wrong. You're wrong. Stop it.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if you read the book, that Bill's definitely, I seem to agree with Bill a lot. But if you
No,
like the
they
first
lean into
20
hard.
pages, what's that?
I said lean into that hard.
Okay. But like the first 20 pages of the clean code book
Yeah.
talks about naming
Chris.
because it's that important.
Sorry, say that again.
The first like 20 pages, within the first 20 pages of the clean code book, they talk about naming because it's that important.
Right.
Because it is, if the naming is bad, the code becomes unreadable very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Let me
So
see if
hang
I
on,
can
let's see what-
remember
Chris, what were you
yeah,
trying
go
to
ahead.
I was saying that his example is different because when you're exporting a variable from like an NG4, you're not shadowing a variable. You're taking a variable from one scope and putting it into another scope. Whereas here, employees is in the whole scope of the entire template, so you are shadowing a variable of say employees as employees. In the NG4
Right.
case, you're not shadowing anything. You're taking something that's internal and then exporting it out. Having the same name is not shadowing.
So,
Right, which is why I'm fine with doing
Which is
index
a-
as index.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the
Getting
fact that
off
it
track.
works technically and doesn't cause a compilation error. I'm worried about confusing people
so
and confusing me, frankly. Index as index, two names for sort of the same thing, but not really the same thing. One's a keyword, one's a name of a variable. And yes, I know we can get away with it. We
But
can
it's
get
not-
away with a lot of things, but that doesn't mean we should
It's
do
a
them.
property name.
That
So you
you.
take a property internal to the NG4 directive and export it as
But
a
that is two
template
different things.
variable.
A property that is about the directive internal behavior that is not directly accessible as a template variable, and now you've created a new thing, a template variable reference that you can use.
and just
And
to
truthfully, I'm willing to die on the employees thing here on that hill. I would lie down and feel bad on the index as index hill. So I don't feel nearly as strongly about that one as observable with the same name as the actual array that comes out of the observable. But
And,
But
and
again,
just for
Maybe if we-
just for the people
Yes.
who are watching this later, I'm putting up an example. Line 19 is what we're talking about. In NG4, in addition to naming a property that's coming out of a particular array, you also have access to the index, whether it's even or odd, the first and the last. But to use that, you need to grab that value. So in this case, we're grabbing the index of the array, but you can't use that down here. You can't use it directly. you have to give it a name. So here we're giving it index as I so that we can use it later. And the question is, how bad is that? This works.
Well,
people disagree.
My point is, what you're really doing here is as a shortcut for saying, let index equal directive.index.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same thing as what you're doing with async pipe, where you're taking a variable that is, has a scope of the entire template, and then creating a new variable that shadows it.
I'm okay with it, just not in the context of teaching.
Yeah.
I don't really care.
I'm fine with that.
No, and it's good to understand the machinery. It absolutely is. I just think it's confusing when you see index as index. And so I would prefer to use separate names just to make it very clear which thing we're talking about.
I always write index as I.
Yeah.
I do
I was
too,
just
but
wondering
because
what
I'm
mine
used
was.
to indexing things as I write first as first and last as last if I'm using those.
My typical convention is for the Booleans, as long as we're talking about this, for first, last, odd, or even, it is first as is first, last as is last, and it makes it very clear in the Boolean expressions.
So like another argument though is that if you were, let's say you found yourself in a component that was way too big, and you're in a big piece of template and you kind of like dive right into the middle of it where someone has done an index as index, I can see arguments for both halves here where like you see index being used to reference the index and you're like, how in the world did I gain access to this keyword deep inside here? On the flip side, if I see I, what in the world is I? Where did that come from? And you have to go back and look for it. So I can see confusion on either half of that.
And what you've done is you've built a really good argument for busting up something that big and complicated.
Sure.
People do not decompose their components nearly enough. So yes.
But I'm not
point
using
well
that
made.
as an argument for one thing or another,
Right.
but just showing how both of those can impact in different ways in
Right.
certain situations.
So
Absolutely.
it might be just better naming in terms of the index, like what's the index for, like it's the index of the employee list or whatever.
While we are
So-
talking
That's a
about
good
naming,
point, too.
and
What
I
value would
promise
be
we'll
over
stop
here?
here in a minute. As long as we're talking about naming, to kind of emphasize the importance of caring about naming, pull up a browser tab and search for Arlo, A-R-L-O, space Belshee, B-E-L-S-H-E-E, naming, right there, already there. Should be an article called, Naming is a Process, Not a Single Step. I love the name of Arlo's blog, by the way, Arlo being bloody stupid. Arlo, very thoughtful person in agile software craftsmanship and all that. Scroll down just slightly. So the stages of naming, missing, we don't have something that's a name. Nonsense, like foo. All the way down to like really thinking your way to a very, very good name. This article is worth reading, but more importantly, it's worth thinking about this stuff and kind of taking it seriously. So it may seem like we're counting angels on the head of a pin, but people should actually care more about this than they really do. Way too often, foo, bar, and baz, or X, Y, Z, when it's not a coordinate system, ends up in production code bases when it really should have been a much more thoughtful process. Anyway.
Even in our context, like the reason why we all care so much about it is that like we're on the hook for accidentally promulgating these practices into these large organizations.
I'm very scared sometimes that something that is so very clearly an example, a silly nonsense example that we're using in class, that 3 years later when that student has become a client and we go back and we find somebody's code base is like, oh, the thing that we thought was a silly throwaway example has been used as a pattern for so much code that came after it, and that happens.
Yeah, one of the things that I've started doing is like, every time I teach, I'm trying to figure out, okay, what can I get out of this experience as well? And I've started like doing this meta layer of discipline that I'm trying to build of, whenever it comes time to live program, it's easy to, in that live programming, to say, I'm just going to make a variable named foo to demonstrate that I can mutate foo in some way. But I've been exercising the art of saying, no, I'm actually going to, on the fly, come up with a concrete example to tie my variable names to. That way even my live coding becomes like a more, less abstract in the sense of, like, oh, these are just throwaway variable names, and more concrete on the axis of, like, no, we're going to do a real example.
Yeah, I will often refactor code, even for things like naming, in class, simply to demonstrate, I'm thinking there's actually a better way to do this, or there's a better name for this, or whatever. I might have started off with a name that is nonsense. Hopefully it's a little better than that. But I'm like, there's a better way to think about this, because I want to demonstrate that behavior. I want people to realize this is an important thing to do.
And even that first touch is, like, the very first time I show you this code that literally just came out of my fingers, my names are going to impact your ability to take it in, learn it,
Yeah.
and then further use these constructs. And so I can either be doing damage with the code I'm trying to demonstrate with, or I can actually be making an impact.
All right, can we make any impact on this code?
So I'm going to make the executive decision of let's go ahead and go with employees pipe async as employee list, just like you've got it, and then we can revisit whether or not we should reflip our convention back to $ across the board later.
I actually
Jack
have
had
an
a
idea on
thought.
Uh-oh.
So I think that we're all in agreement that we like employees as the name of the observable. So I think that we should come up with a thought or a convention about what we should do when we do the async as pattern. And so employee list is kind of dodging that by just like coming up with a very similar name, right? Like the difference between employees and employee list is we're expressing their plurality with an S versus the word list.
And it wouldn't work if this were employee with, not an array.
Right. And so
The employee is what
right.
happens in my code a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
I wonder if, so keeping employees as the name of the observable, like a pattern that we could do when we have specifically, we're taking an observable, running it through the async pipe, and then aliasing it, would be calling the thing that comes out, the observable name, and then like sync or cache or something that expresses that this is our synchronous version of that value.
Yeah, or like value. Or
Yeah, value would be
snapshot
good.
Or something like that. Or like the behavior subject it has the dot value. It references as what Jack's saying. It's an observable is these things over time. And now we're unpacking it as the thing at this particular.
But so
I
here's
really
the
like
challenge.
snapshot.
Here's the problem with all of that, is that we're once again, like the exact same argument applies of like why we didn't encode the type into the observable name in the first place. All those arguments still hold true here.
Yeah, and we
I feel
are
like we're just flipping the problem.
yeah,
and
we're
adding
we're
the
establishing a
S's.
brand new convention where there is a convention that not everybody loves, but it exists already. People are relatively familiar with it, even if they're familiar with it because they dislike it. I like this thought process. I don't know if we want to try to cram all of it, continue cramming all of it into this.
I think we need to
I think
move
we've
on.
hit it as hard as we can.
Yeah.
All right.